Our third speaker is Dr. Alexandra Fiocco. She's in the Department of Psychology at Ryerson University. She's director of the Stress and Healthy Aging Research Lab. She's trying to identify predictors of cognitive aging and well-being in later life and those elements of lifestyle that support healthy aging. One element that would support healthy aging, and in fact, a healthy life throughout the lifespan, is coping with stress. And that's what Dr. Fiocco is going to address. Dr. Fiocco.
Thank you, Jay, and good afternoon, everyone. So let me just get right into it, coping. So what is coping? Coping can be defined as cognitive and behavioral efforts that a person engages in to manage specific either external or internal demands that are appraised as stressful. So that appraisal piece is really important. And remember, Dr. Dupin talked about how we may appraise a certain environment, especially say a relative stressor. Now, much of the research in coping stems from the efforts of Dr. Susan Folkman and Dr. Richard Lazarus. And so a lot of this coping, or at least the model of coping, stems from the transactional model of stress that Richard Lazarus actually developed. And these two scientists developed two broad coping categories. So we have problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping. And the difference between these two broad coping strategies is that problem-focused coping strategies are strategies that aim to directly manipulate the stressor, the thing that's causing the stress. Whereas emotion-focused coping strategies are those strategies that aim to change your perception of the stress or how you're relating to that stressor. Now, of course, there's been a lot of research over the past few decades, and these two broad categories have been extended further to create a more comprehensive model. So we could also look at coping strategies as an intersection along two dimensions. So we still have problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping, but we could also further divide these two categories into approach and avoidance coping. So I've inserted a few specific strategies within each of these quadrants. Now, with respect to what's adaptive and what's maladaptive, what works and what doesn't work, the research is very messy for a number of reasons, a lot of it being methodology. And so there's no gold standard in measuring coping strategies. And, it really depends on the context or the stressor that you're dealing with. What's important, however, and what we do see that shows up over and over again is that, whether or not you have control over the situation will determine whether problem-focused coping is adaptive. So if you have no control over the situation, then using problem-focused coping strategies might actually increase that sense of stress. Whereas emotion-focused coping strategies may be more effective in those contexts where you have no control. And this is actually called the goodness of fit hypothesis. So there needs to be a fit. Most importantly, however, flexibility is key. And so what you want to do is you want to have a toolbox of coping strategies, a toolbox of coping skills so that you could kind of pull out these different strategies from your toolbox depending on the context or the stressor that you're managing. So again, the coping literature is quite messy, and I always like to take a more comprehensive view. So over the last few years, I have been focusing more on lifestyle behaviors. Now, our lifestyle behaviors can really support how we manage the stressors in our life. Life in itself can be quite chaotic. And so there's no such thing as a life without stressors. So it really is, what are we doing? How are we engaging in life every day to ensure that we can manage our stress? And so I have a few lifestyle behaviors listed here. And so the first is dietary intake. So one thing is that our diet interconnects with chronic stress or with stress. For one thing, research shows that about 2/3 of us are hyperphagic, meaning that we tend to engage in emotional eating when we're feeling stress. And the thing is that when we engage in emotional eating, we're not eating healthy things like carrots and celery. We tend to gravitate towards foods that are palatable, foods that are high in fat, high in sugar, high in salt. And so even though initially, emotional eating can dampen our stress response, over the long run, this can be a maladaptive coping strategy because it can increase our risk for type 2 diabetes and other metabolic disorders. it's also important to consider what we're ingesting. So how much caffeine, how much nicotine do you take in? So what we know is that nicotine and caffeine are sympathomimetics. So they actually mimic our sympathetic nervous system, meaning that they increase our stress reactivity to stressors. Another important thing to consider is our dietary pattern. So are you eating a healthy kind of Mediterranean type diet, or are you engaging or eating a more Western type pattern that's high in fats and processed foods? Dietary pattern is associated with healthy body. So in terms of Western dietary pattern, this is associated with increased inflammation in the body, and inflammation in the body is tightly connected with our stress sensitive systems. Also, I have vitamins here. So with chronic stress actually depletes our water soluble vitamins. So it depletes our vitamin C, it depletes our B vitamins. So if we're not getting this in our diet naturally, then we may want to think about supplementation. Physical activity is the second lifestyle behavior. So what we know about physical activity is that it has been shown to strengthen our immune system. It strengthens our cardiovascular system. And research shows that physical activity modulates the stress response. So people who are physically fit actually show lower physiological reactivity, so those stress hormones that Dr. Dupien had mentioned, as well as less negative affect following a stressor. People who are physically fit are also better at recovering from a stressor as well. Social engagement. So social engagement, of course, we know that social support is considered a powerful buffer of stress. Now, Dr. Baines talked about, well, maybe not in all cases, right? There might be certain contexts where that social engagement might actually be contagious and might actually increase our stress. So generally what we have seen in the literature is, there was an interesting publication in 2010 that suggests that social isolation is the equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Research does show that social engagement and social support is associated with enhanced immune function, which is tightly connected with stress management. It's also been shown to modulate the stress response, but again, there's a bit of caution here in terms of what the literature shows. So whether or not stress or social support can buffer stress is really dependent on your individual characteristics. So individuals who have this trait of being a little less agreeable, more disagreeable, may not benefit from social supports as much as someone who scores high on trait compassion, for example. Also, the quality of the relationships are very important. So there's research that shows that if you have more ambivalent friends, that this type of social support from ambivalent parties may actually increase your stress response. The final piece that I wrote here is contemplative practice. So of course, my research does look at mindfulness training and compassion training in the context of family caregivers of persons with neurodegenerative disease. And family caregivers are seen in the literature as being a model of chronic stress. And so what has been shown in the literature is that, mindfulness training, compassion training, that this is associated with reduced stress reactivity in the laboratory. It's also associated with decreased perceptions of stress and decrease in reported depressive symptoms, which is associated with stress as well. Now, of course, this is an area that's quite contentious in terms of the literature, but generally what we're seeing is that the cultivation of resilience and attitudes that align with some of the coping strategies that I showed you on the other slide, such as acceptance, meaning making, positive reinterpretation. These are the things that we're sort of cultivating with mindfulness and compassion training. So at the end of the day, we have to question, we live in this chaotic world. And so how are we coping? How are we managing day to day? And how are we sort of cultivating sort of the skills in order to be able to thrive in the context of stress rather than being overwhelmed in the context of stress?